Welcome to Talking Absolute Worship. We are recording in the beginning of March and it is still freezing. So we are all freezing. So do forgive us if we're shivering and shaking. So you may be listening to this in the balmy, proper spring. We're in one of the many false springs in the UK when you think it's spring and then it's not. And then you have to turn the heating back on again because you were too quick to turn it off. Either way, we're going to be talking absolute worship. We've got some, I said, non-narrative kind of passages to look at. Although Paul in Areopagus is vaguely narrative, isn't it? But most of the actual text,
yeah, but that's not this week.
Oh, it's not even this week. So yeah. Good point. Mostly the first one from Acts is a little bit narrative. Much of it is ideas. So hopefully between the three of us, we're not short of ideas. You only need one to set you running, preparing your sermon, and maybe one of the things we're about to say will give you that vital key to unlock your own creative processes. Who better to ask to unlock your creative processes than Rachel, who is eager to tell us what ideas she's got about preaching these texts for this week. Rachel, where do you think you're going?
Well, one of the things that I don't like about this period after Easter is that we don't have any Old Testament readings. We have the Psalms, but we don't have any other Old Testament readings. And I do find that I really miss them. And then it kind of makes me a little bit, it perhaps colours the way I approach Acts then, because I'm kind of mumbling to myself, we've got all this stuff from Acts and I'd rather have an Old Testament reading. However, I am thinking about the Old Testament, not the Old Testament, the Acts reading this week, along with the Psalm and 1 Peter. Ooh. Because I like to try and kind of think of some theme or phrase or something that kind of holds it all together in my mind. And the phrase that I was thinking about this week is maybe life and death, or I was trying to think of an opposite to rejection, but I couldn't really come up with one that I liked, because often we would talk about rejection or acceptance, but I feel like rejection is a really active word, and acceptance seems a little bit more passive. So whatever, if you can come up with some powerful opposite to rejection, I would like that.
Embracing.
Yeah. So that was the other thing I thought about. There's a book, it's quite an old book now, by the Eastern European theologian Miroslav Volf, called From Exclusion to Embrace. So I was thinking maybe exclusion and embrace could be my words. But in all of the three readings that I've mentioned, leaving aside the gospel, there is this sort of sense of life and death, of rejection and embrace. And so I thought it would be a good thing to explore. The Acts reading picks up at the end of what's been a kind of fairly long sermon. And if you don't read what's gone before, then it just seems a bit, I don't know, wishy-washy in some ways. You kind of, the lectionary launches us into this bit. We don't really, we're not asked to read what's gone before. I think we have to make that decision. Stephen's been preaching about the saving activity of God throughout the history of Israel, through the life of Israel. He's also talked about the stubbornness of the people, and the people rejected Moses, and the people denied their dependence on God. They worshipped idols. He's done the whole kind of, let's do salvation history in one sermon, which is difficult. And he then accuses the people who are there of being just the same. So it's a really quite powerful message that Stephen has. And then we pick it up at the end. And what Stephen has said has made his listeners so kind of angry and so deaf to reason, really, that they just want to kill him. And in contrast, Stephen has got this kind of peaceful, shiny vision of beauty and joy and God. And Stephen stands there and prays forgiveness, like Jesus, for those who are attacking him. And obviously then at the very end of the reading, it sets the scene for Paul to come along. But you've got, in a sense, you've got Stephen who's actively about to die, and yet actually Stephen is the one with life. And you've got the executioners, the crowd, the attackers, who are putting him to death, and yet actually they're the ones who are dead. So I thought that was quite an interesting sort of contrast, and links fairly obviously, I think, with the psalm. The psalmist is obviously also under threat and is praying for rescue, and he has the confidence that God is that place of rescue. Talks about refuges and rocks and fortresses and lots of very strong words that come up sort of repeatedly. And also the verbs, asking God to lead and guide and redeem and deliver, and they're all really kind of quite powerful words. And in the psalm, you've got this sense that God is faithful, that the psalmist knows that and is kind of holding on to that and just hands his life over to God. And even if he faces death in reality, he believes that with God there is life. So I liked the way those two passages could work together. And then I thought about the 1 Peter reading, because of this idea about rejection or exclusion, that we're being built, if you like, as he puts it, into the household of God. And he talks about the rejection of Jesus, and yet, you know, in Jesus' life, Jesus becomes the cornerstone, and so we have a new standing because we are embraced, we are accepted, we are welcomed, and whether we, you know, whatever rejection and whatever exclusion we may have faced before, we are chosen and precious, and we have a place in this household of God that is not earned. There's nothing we can do to to get our invitation. It's there, and we're admitted through God's love and mercy. So I was really mainly just, I think, going to focus on how does it feel? How does it feel to be rejected and excluded? And then how does it feel to know that actually we have a God who embraces all of us? So
I very much warm to your question. You know, where is life in this story of the stoning of Stephen? I mean, it also comes up in John, doesn't it? I am way, truth, and life. I am life. Jesus says, I was getting, maybe we'll come back to this. You know, how to emphasize or not emphasize the the's in that I am the way. Some commentators obviously say they're not there. Well, they clearly are there. If you look at them, they clearly are there. Hot, isn't it? But they're not always translated, are they? So you know, I do prefer I am way, truth, and life. It's closer to what I think Jesus is saying. But you know, I am life. What does that life look like? For Stephen, it looks like imminent death. Jesus, it looked like imminent. Well, it was death. So what? Yeah, there's yeah. I think you've brought that out really nicely. The stony stuff is also like, there's so many images in here, aren't there? I mean, these readings, there's so many metaphors, and there's kind of a risk of confusing your congregation, I think, if you try and pick them all. Even Peter, it looks like he's getting a bit confused because he starts off, so what am I going to go with? I'll go with like feeding babies. Yeah, that's what I'll go with.
Yeah.
So he starts off like with the whole feeding babies thing and milk and think, oh, we're going to get breast milk and we're going to get solid foods. And it's no, sod that. Let's go for stones. We're going for stones. And he leaves the whole baby milky thing behind. And think, where was that going there?
Yes.
It's just like he needed a good editor or something. So
yeah, it kind of dumps all his images out there, doesn't he? Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
We all do that in sermons from time to time.
Yeah.
We suddenly see the blank faces in front of us and think, oh,
no, change it up, right? I think I hadn't gone as far as you, Rachel, in digging into the Acts passage. So thank you to that. And I think that powerful message of Stephen facing death and yet being the one who has life. I think that could have real preaching resonance. I think I got a bit stuck on the whole stoning thing.
I was interested as well, the contrast between the stones of death and the stones of life in Peter and Stephen as well. So I like that. But there was something in the I thought that is really interesting what you were just saying, Rachel, and I was kind of thinking down a similar route, and particularly there's the contrast of Stephen and Saul and where their lives are up to, and of course I often say, when I'm preaching, we know the end of the story, so we know what happens with Saul, but actually at this point Saul doesn't know what's happening with Saul, and he's doing what he thinks is right, and yet that's actually the thing of death. And you think about, his torments in some of his writings about, I do what I think I do what I think was right, but actually it turns out to be wrong, and all of that kind of conflict that goes on for him. I was also intrigued by where the lectionary stops the reading of Stephen's stoning, because I think if I do use this, I'm going to carry on to the second verse of chapter 8, because it gives us a little picture of the aftermath, which I think is really relevant. Because first of all, it's the church, the church starting to scatter, which is possibly who Peter was writing to, was the scattered, and so the people who had been displaced. And so that kind of, you're precious in God's sight, you may have lost and had to displace, but actually you've come back together and been formed into a new people. And I think that's really powerful about people that are forced out and then can actually find a place back. But then also there's the lament over Stephen, and I think I think sometimes when we talk about life and death in faith, we just want to talk about the life bit. And wasn't it wonderful that Stephen died like Jesus did, saying, don't hold this against them, but actually what happens to is the ones who loved him, actually they lament. And I was reading some stuff about just how, yes, it's important to remember that Stephen is still close to God and God has not left Stephen, but actually that lament for those left behind. And because we're not always very good at lamenting and mourning. I read in one of the books I was reading about this, it said Christians should in fact lament the loss of all those whose courageous voices pointed toward life, and in so doing were the friends of God. And I thought, yeah, there's something here actually about us acknowledging those whose lives are lost in in faith, and the fact that causes us pain. We can't just say, oh, they've gone to be with the Lord, hallelujah. Actually, no, that causes us pain because we've lost those people, and there's been such a lot of loss for people in recent years. So I thought it was really interesting that the lectionary stops us before we hear about the aftermath as well, because
I think that's
it's really relevant. Yeah, and where the Psalm speaks into that. Yeah.
And actually, sorry,
you're right. We sometimes do. Oh, sorry. Carry on, Rachel.
No, I was just going to say, I've just noticed actually that the reading stops at the very end of chapter 7, and the verse about Paul is chapter 8, verse 1.
It is. Yes.
So we shouldn't even have that.
Shouldn't even have that. No, it's true.
I hadn't even investigated that. No. I think you're right. It's a weird way to talk about someone being stoned to death. If you read a newspaper report about someone being stoned to death, you would talk about the horrific nature of stoning.
Yes.
If you were in the country or knew the family, you would talk about the devastating impact on the family. And
yes.
Yet, here we are in church blithely talking about a man being stoned to death, and what we're saying was, isn't it great?
Yes. Yes.
So I mean, well, I thank you for pointing that out, because it is so easy to do, isn't it? I mean, maybe all of us would pause for thought if we were doing this, and this suddenly said, "Can you do this in a primary school?" Then all of us go, "Oh, hang on, no, hang on, oh, is this?" But would we have a similar pause for thought doing this on a regular Sunday morning, thinking, talking about a violent death here? And I love your connection to lament. I mean, think about like Jonathan and David.
Yes.
Jonathan obviously suffers a violent death, and David's lament is a great thing, I think, to say. Yeah, it's not just, as you said. I'm just repeating what you said now. It's not just triumphant, going to heaven, done the right thing, being a martyr, because we're not that big on encouraging people into martyrdom nowadays.
No.
We're not that big.
No, it's not a big part of our tradition. No,
it's not. No, and it's not favourably looked upon by the press, because it's looked upon as like idiot suicide bombers who are being groomed and told nonsense stories in order to suit a political or national agenda. And so it's not got a great press, perhaps with good reason. And yet here we are with this story in the middle of the New Testament about go to death because of your faith. Why not?
Yeah.
It's a good thing.
Yeah. And I guess, and I just noticed that I put in my notes here as well, that then of course there's a link with the John reading, because of its because of its strong connection with funerals and Jesus preparing the disciples for his death, and and the questions of, but we don't know where you're going, and now that wondering what's going to happen, and that's actually part of their lament before he's died, is that kind of panic, because lament is sometimes about panic, and all of that stuff that goes on. And it's okay. Jesus just embraces those questions and says, yeah, okay, you do know, actually, don't panic, breathe, and remember. Yeah, good words.
It's interesting, isn't it? They're for viewers, I realise viewers may tune out now in their swathes, but there are at least some viewers who listen to the Archers, and recently there has been a big sudden surprise death in the Archers, and the Archers have decided they're going to go with grief. They're going to try and demonstrate in every single character a different way of grieving. It's quite.
It's true.
I think for those of us who deal with grief, obviously in our professional capacity as ministers, we encounter grief. We can spot it, but it is fascinating to see. I think maybe slightly clumsily done, I think, in the Archers at the moment, the number of different, everybody is responding in a different way. Go, that's just, that's a way of dealing with grief. Had you noticed that? And you think, oh, really? But yeah, I think
it's becoming a public service broadcast.
That's what it was set up as a public service broadcast about farming.
Exactly. Yes, it's returning to its roots. Yes. Yeah.
But, yeah, and so I always, obviously, like most people, have this at funerals, this thing, and I always introduce this reading by saying, these are words Jesus set his face towards Jerusalem. These are words that Jesus used to prepare his disciples for his own death. And then I usually say, of course, there are no words that can prepare anyone for the death of a loved one. But then I say, but these words were written down, and we can hear them today. And it's almost like in death, we know that stuff that we say in grief isn't going to have the impact in the moment that you say it. But it doesn't mean we shouldn't say it. And you say, this will mean nothing now, but actually I found that it's true. And interestingly, the person they send to see not to give any spoilers away, the chief mourner, next of kin, is somebody who's also experienced loss himself, and he's sort of put up as the person who actually understands. And he says, "Yeah, I know you won't, I know you. None of this will make sense now, but believe me." But none of us can hear that at the moment, can we? None of us can hear that in the time. We have to discover it for ourselves. And I think there's something about that rings through all these gospel readings, is that this promise of new life, this thing that Stephen has, is never something that you can just adopt from someone else. You can be told about it all you like, but you have to discover it for yourself. There's no shortcut to it, is there? Towards any of this knowledge about life. And Jesus talking about being the way.
Yeah, I was just thinking that. Yeah,
you know, how do we? You've got to immerse yourself in it, in the life. It's not head knowledge. That's what way, truth, and life is. It's about what people call a lived experience nowadays. Is the phrase, isn't it? It's my lived experience. We could adopt that or steal it from whatever. I'm still not 100%, to be fair, clear exactly what it means. I think it means different things in different contexts, doesn't it? But this Christian faith is a lived experience. Stephen's obviously had the lived experience, and that's where his life comes from. It comes from Jesus, who is life. I'm waffling now. So, Anne, rescue me. Where were you thinking of going with these readings?
well, I don't know exactly. I mean, I think the stuff that we were just talking about the lament and all of that, I think that's one of my possibilities. But I think there's also the possibility of contrasting Stephen and Saul's story, and of sort of maybe telling a bit of what we know of Stephen up to this point, and then what we know of Saul beyond this point, and kind of using the Acts story as a sort of a transition moment, as it is in the book of Acts. It is this moment when we're turning direction now, and we're going to find out about this strange bloke called Saul, who it turns out you all know, by the way. And you know, and so there's that I might look at, and then linking in where do we go with our faith, and that might take me to the Psalm, which I was thinking, you know, as I was reading the Psalm, I thought, yes, and these are words that Stephen would have known. And I always love reminding myself when I look at Hebrew scripture, when we're looking at and the New Testament, that you know, when we're talking about people in the New Testament, often they would have had such a familiarity with these words that we also have a familiarity with, and that what do we go to? Which I guess actually links with what you were just saying, Phil, and I was just making some notes about this being immersed in it, this way, truth, and life stuff, and of being immersed. And I think it's Eugene Peterson in his book Along Obedience in the Same Direction, which I just think is a fantastic title, Along Obedience in the Same Direction. And just think, yeah, that is what it's about. But he says something like, one of the things I've become aware of that is from contemporary culture that is dangerous to Christians is the belief that anything worthwhile can be achieved at once. And this whole thing that it's this ongoing, and Stephen is steeped in his faith, but so is Saul. Saul is also, you know, Saul is not a bad man. Saul is steeped in his faith, and he just is in conflict within himself. And so how do we actually find our way in that? How do we find our truth in that? How do we find our life in that? So there's all those kind of images going on in my head, and and drawing ourselves back to these extraordinary words in the Psalm, which I thought were wonderful, and the connection between, you know, Stephen and Jesus and the Psalm, and into your hands I commit my spirit, and all of that stuff of where God is. So yeah, so that's where my head is at the moment. Yes. So I may well be exploring that, but who knows?
Rachel.
I was just going to sort of add in another thought which had come to me from John, but I wasn't really going to. I thought I probably might not go down the John route, but over the next few weeks, you could do a lot about the word dwelling, which I know in a previous year I talked about abide, and I think it's the same word, because we've got Jesus talking about the dwelling place in that sense. Later on, when he talks about I'm the vine, abide in me, dwell in me. I feel like Jesus now is kind of talking about that sort of permanent, the end of the journey, if you like, of dwelling in Christ is that dwelling place that he talks about. So I would, and that's the sort of security of the divine presence, all of that maybe wrapped up in the dwelling place. So maybe you could link that with the psalm, and that sense of rock, fortress, dwelling place.
Abiding crops up next week, so you might want to keep your powder dry later on in John 14. I think we've talked a lot about abiding. It doesn't on Talking Absolute Worship throughout this year. It's kind of been a recurring theme. This word, just how powerful the word abide is. I don't know where I'm going yet with this, to be honest. I'm often tempted to sort of go off piste a bit sometimes when I read stuff and do like a word study. Sometimes I quite like to do a character study, like when we do Thomas. I quite like to go off and do one on Thomas, or when a little known character comes up and we know other stuff, a bit like Anne saying, well, we could find out what do we know about Stephen other than that he was stoned to death. But I'm sort of drawn to, well, the obvious one is rocks, isn't it? Because we've got rocks as refuge, we've got rocks being chucked at Stephen, we've got rocks being a cornerstone. I do love this cornerstone image, and I'm not sure if I've got it right as to why it was used here, but my sense of the importance of the cornerstone is a bit like a jigsaw. When you do a jigsaw, you put the corners in first. It orients the whole thing, doesn't it? And if you put the chief cornerstone of a building in first, then it determines the horizontal, but both the axes, the X and Y axes, because they have to go off that stone. So you now know it determines those, and it also determines going upwards, because they all have to be set at 90 degrees to that stone. And so any point in 3D space from then on in this building is set by that stone. And I quite like the imagery of that. And so I think I might spend some time bringing that out. If Jesus is the cornerstone, what does that mean for any point in those of us who are built up into the living building of God, the house of God? Any point in that, any part of that, any bit you happen to be standing in or whatever is oriented by Christ. Its position is determined by Christ. What does that mean in practical terms? So the other one, maybe a bit left field, that I thought might be worth a look or might not, is the coats being laid at the feet, because I was arrested by that. It's a little detail, isn't it? And
isn't it?
I'm drawn by little details, and so I started to think of other instances where coats or cloaks were involved. And is it Bartimaeus who leaves his cloak? And then there's Jesus's cloak on the cross. There's got to be other ones if you look them up.
Palm Sunday.
The cloaks on so there's a whole cloaky thing. I don't know whether there's any mileage, and sometimes I just like to do that just because I get bored and I like to do something different. And so just picking out a word study and saying, let's follow cloaks today, or let's follow rocks. I don't think I'll do spiritual milk, because Peter gives up on that after like one. No, that's not going anywhere, is it?
Peter gave up on that.
Or if I was going into John, the temptation when you're looking at this is to just zone straight into the red, glaring, flashing verse I am the way, the truth, and the life, isn't it? Because everybody knows that. Everybody knows that verse. But I'm actually drawn by the sentence that comes after it. I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. Blah blah blah. If you know me, you will know my Father also. And I guess it depends what kind of congregation you're talking to, as it always does. But so often in today's world, you hear very sterile discussions about the existence of God, that kind of stuff. And I'm old enough and wise enough just not to get involved in them anymore. But I mean, there's a whole population who think that the question of faith is, does God exist? And it's a philosophical question, isn't it? It's something that you can argue about philosophically, or from a science versus religion angle, or whatever. It's that kind of discussion. And Jesus sort of short circuits that and says, no, it's nothing to do with that. You don't need to worry about any of that. What it's about is, if you've seen me, you've seen the Father. If you know me, you know the Father. It's a personal thing. Everything that you need to. I mean, as Christians, we know this. Everything that you need to know about God is visible in the life of Jesus, and more than that, in the living of the life of Jesus. Everything that you need to know about God is in the living of the life of Jesus. It's not a philosophical question. It's an immersive question. I like your word, Anne. It's an immersive question. So
I think it's your word to start with.
Show us the Father, give us a miracle. That was their language, wasn't it? We wouldn't use those language now. We say, give us a philosophical proof, etc. But Jesus, that's nonsense. And I've often tried to put into different language, I am the way, the truth, and the life, what it means. I had another go this time. I'm not sure I've made it any easier. But I think I'd go with something like, I'm not just alive, but I am life. I'm not just alive, but I'm life itself. And that's God, isn't it? I'm not just loving, I am love itself. I'm not just alive, I am life itself. It gets more difficult for the other ones. So for truth, another version of the word that is translated truth is reality. So I am the truth. I am reality. All reality is revolves around me. I invade all of it. I'm part of all of it. I'm not just a guide. I'm not just a guide to show you the way with my umbrella and follow me through the city. But I'm the place that you need to get to as well. I am the whole package. I'm the whole thing. I'm not just a guide. I am the way to everything that's important.
I am the way.
Yeah. So you get back to what John wrote.
But exactly. Yeah. See, I don't have a problem with the way, the truth, and the life. I don't see it in a. I don't. It doesn't to me say. It to me, what it says is that Jesus is telling us something that is real, and that can be trusted. So I don't have an issue with it, but I know that for some people it flags up all sorts of.
Well, it's the sentence that comes after that's linked to it.
Yes.
No one comes to the Father except through me. Then it says, well, therefore all the religions are nonsense.
Yes, I know exactly. Yes.
So
yes.
I don't know. You were going to say something, Rachel?
No, it just occurred to me when you were talking about things being immersive that maybe that's another kind of angle to take, particularly kind of where now I live in Theatreland in London. Everything about theatre seems to be heading into an immersive route. And you can go to an immersive experience of the Peaky Blinders, for example, and immersive this, that, and the other. Next week. I'm going to an immersive 1920s jazz experience.
Wow!
So everything's about trying to help people not to just sit there and be audience, but to be joining in and immersed in it. And I think that's actually, when you said the word immersive, it just suddenly thought that's absolutely it, isn't it? It's not sitting there in the audience watching it going on. It's being part of it.
Oh,
and that links to living stones as well, because the living stones are actually that it's not about sitting with the stones around you. It's actually you are, you're not, the building doesn't house you, you are the building. That's very immersive, isn't it, that Peter's talking about as well. Yes,
they're doing artists as well, aren't they? There's a Salvador Dali one just open, I think, where you can have an immersive experience, and you sit in a room and the pictures are all moving around you and whatever. I can't really picture it.
I went to the Van Gogh one.
Oh yeah, that's the bloke.
Wow.
Yeah, it was in Bristol before I moved, and it was a really good thing, actually. Really enjoyed it.
Yeah. Excellent.
Oh, there you go. Right. Okay, that's like a billion ideas.
It is. I was going to say there's sermons here for yrA now, probably for the rest of my ministry. Yeah.
I imagine everyone's tuned out now because they've just like said, yeah, okay, I'll go with that, and then turned it off. So we're not now talking to anyone. So you could relax. But an opportunity for how else these readings might inspire the other parts of our worship experience that we might design. Rachel, have you come up with anything?
Just a couple of ideas, really. I'd probably like to use the hymn where there's the chorus, "All are welcome in this place," because it talks about building a house where love.
It does. Well, it does.
And that talks, it's about embracing and acceptance and all of that. I was thinking that maybe I could tell some stories with rocks. I could have an array of rocks, and I could sort of, tell the story. What might the rock have to say? Well, this rock might, this rock was there, when this happened, when Stephen was stoned. Well, this rock is, the rock that the psalmist was kind of, sitting on when he was imagining Jesus. When he was imagining God. Like this rock is, I don't know. So, I don't know. You could play with it. There's rocks everywhere, not just in our readings today. So you could bring in other rocks. Rocks themselves crying out in praise if people were quiet. So maybe you could do something with rocks. But I thought I'd probably like to send people home with a bulb as well, because it's the classic. It looks like it's pretty dead. And sort of
a plant bulb, not a light bulb.
One that goes in the ground, not one that goes in the ceiling. Yeah. I was just going there. Yeah.
Some kind of bulb, because we're thinking about Stephen looked like he was the one who was dead, but actually he was the one that was alive. Get people to take home some bulbs and plant them. I don't want to go down the road of trying to get people to think too much about when they were, how does it feel to be excluded, because there can be some quite useful, so obviously it's important to acknowledge that, but at the same time I don't want it to become an exercise in, well, I was never picked for the team, or everyone talks good, because even though those things are probably true, I think I want us to be able to kind of move beyond that. So yeah,
good point, because
I'm now thinking about playing Janice Ian at 17. So I learned Janice Ian at 17 I learned the truth, for those whose names were never called when picking sides for basketball. There you go. But maybe not, you never know. I might just go into a maudlin huddle in the corner.
Well, that's what I don't want to end up.
Yes.
Yeah, good point. Because sometimes they have unforeseen consequences. These things that we introduce, don't they? And people go off down a track they don't expect them to. How dare they?
You need to hold them pastorally carefully. Indeed. Yes.
I once did a thing with stones. That's just one of the things my kids still tease me about. At least they remember it, I suppose. It was, I think, must have been Palm Sunday, where I built a pile of rocks and I hid inside, because there was no technology back then. So I hid inside a kid's tape. The only tape recorder I had was a kid's tape recorder that you could speak into, and it would record things. So I had this plastic kid's tape recorder, and I did half of a dialogue, and it was on this tape recorder inside this pile of stones, and it was based on if Jesus saying if these people were to keep silent, the stones would cry aloud. So I had this little conversation with the stones. It was very stilted because I tried to time it, but you never get it quite right. Who are you? And they all go, we're stones. And the kids still tease me about the voice I did for the stones speaking, and I had to put the microphone up to the stones, and they go, we're stones. I do like that idea because there is something about a stone, isn't there? And it's sheer the ancientness of it. People often say, "Oh, this tree was around when Henry VIII was around." You think, "Well, these stones are around when the chopping dinosaurs were here." Never mind Henry VIII. They've seen everything, except they haven't got eyes, so they didn't. There you go. But the idea is powerful, isn't it? So I think there's a lot in that. You could extend it to like a little pile of. You could have a little pile of rubble, couldn't you? And you could say, this rubble is a false refuge. It's a fortress that people thought would stand forever, but isn't. And God is our only refuge. There's all sorts of mileage with that, Rachel.
There is.
I think that's. And if I was thinking of going down a stony theme, you've just strengthened that idea, really. So I might find myself doing that rather than cloaks or baby food. Anne,
I was thinking about doing a bit of building. If I looked at Peter, I will do a bit of building. I might use some Jenga bricks and Jenga towers to get talking about what makes a flexible structure and what makes a one that's more weak and things. We had a very, very interesting conversation with our elders a few weeks ago. About we had 2 Jenga towers and we were just playing around with them and talking about what makes things more flexible and yet makes things more vulnerable. And one of our elders is an architect, and so that was really interesting because he was talking about what was going on. And that, of course, a Jenga tower with holes in, you can get it higher, but you can't do anything with it because you can't move things around on it. And then the regular Jenga tower, as soon as you start moving things out, it becomes more vulnerable. But actually, that's maybe what we have to be. And it was there was some really interesting conversations there. So I might play Jenga. I've got some giant Jenga bricks. Well, they're not huge giant. They're not like going to kill a child size, but they're kind of this. Apparently, you can get them so big that they could. There you go.
A crane to move
the stoning of Stephen with Jenga bricks. But I've got a good sized Jenga set that you can use in church, which is good. The other thing I'm wondering about, although I might not do this, but because I've done it before, but is to build a cairn of the stones that representing the people, the living stones that have influenced us, both those now and those who have gone, and maybe also remembering those who are at home, who don't come to worship anymore, but are still part of our community. And then, of course, you could take that higher and say, the cairn will go on growing with stones that we don't know yet. So there's a whole idea of so because I was thinking about we can use stones for killing people or for guiding the way, and all of that malarkey. So so I was thinking about maybe using some building-y stuff, but my jury is still out because about what exactly I'm going to do yet, because it's some time to think about that.
No, I think that the whole stones thing is obviously it's got mileage. I remember once I did some work with the church in North Devon, and they were looking for what their purpose in life was, as many churches are. What are we even doing? And one of the things that we did was we tried to reconnect the congregation with its past, because I think it's important. And so they did do that stones thing that you're talking about. We've got great stones of congregation members from the past who they remembered. And they actually, I think they decorated them. I took some stony decorating pens and they decorated the stones. And then they put their own stones in to place themselves into the story of this church and connect
Yes.
themselves to a longer story than theirs is, but to recognize that they're part of it. And it can be quite powerful, I think, to do that kind of stuff. And people are used to painting stones nowadays and decorating.
Yes, they are.
It's like a kind of thing, isn't it? So of course there's the opposite imagery in 1 Peter of there's living stones, the positive stony imagery, but then there's the stumbling block, isn't there? I'm not really not sure what a stumbling block is. I mean, was there a purposeful thing that was called a stumbling block, or did people just trip over stones in those days? I haven't found anything that said there was a thing called a stumbling block that was deliberately put in places to make people trip over it. But
perhaps it's a stone that's not in the right place. It can become a stumbling block.
Gets in the way.
I don't know.
So maybe
get rid of that stone.
Today's idea would be like a tripwire or a piece of Lego. Or
ow!
Piece of Lego.
Pain.
So I thought, I wonder if there's anything in that. But I also liked Peter. He's not happy with the spiritual milk and then the stones, because then he piles on a whole load more at the end. He just says, "Oh yeah, by the way, you're a chosen race. You're a royal priesthood. You're a holy nation." Think,
love it all in.
Not even go there. But, I mean, that's like. I mean, there's huge questions in there about how
we
deal with chosen status nowadays. We're quite shy of this whole language of chosen status, and yet trailblazed here, don't they? This is who you are. You're the chosen ones. You're the special ones. You're the holy nation. You're the God's royal priesthood. So where do we go with that? I don't know. But then I like the bit at the end where he says, "Once you were not a people, now you are God's people. Once you had not received mercy, now you have received mercy." So I quite like the pattern of the once you were, now you are. Once you were, now you are. And I think you could play with that with the congregation.
It lends itself some responses, doesn't it, or something like that? Yes.
Yeah, and ask a congregation how if you were describing yourself in that situation on your faith journey. Once I was, now I am. What would it look like once and people would obviously say, once I was lost, now I'm found. But it'd be nice to get past that and have some other imagery for how people. So you're going to get lost and found, because that's obviously biblical. But it'd be nice to try and get the congregation to use their imaginations to say, is there and it doesn't mean they have to be dramatic, they don't have to be complete opposites, but once I was, now I'm. So you get the idea. So I might use that just to play around with. And the only other thing I had was maybe slightly more depressing, but there we go. You have to deal with it, don't you? The whole Acts thing is a really gruesome, horrific stoning to death, and it still happens.
Yes,
it was very much live in the news a couple of years ago in Iran, wasn't it?
Yes, it was.
Women to death. It's still. I looked it up. It still happens in Iran, Afghanistan, Nigeria, Somalia, Brunei, Pakistan, Mali, United Arab Emirates, Qatar, and Yemen. And in many of those countries, it's legal. In some of those countries, it happens whether or not it's legal. It's not to say it happens every day, but it happens. And it's absolutely horrific. So there's obviously a connection into maybe thinking about how we deal with our prayers of intercession, maybe. And maybe there's also a link into Stephen being stoned to death, really because of his faith. And to highlight the work of Amnesty International. You might even get the congregation involved in one of Amnesty's campaigns. They could write a letter there and then, depending on what kind of assembly you've got. They certainly could be made aware of Amnesty's campaign. So people who right now are maybe not facing stoning to death, but are sitting in a cell simply because of their beliefs. So and just not to sort of rush past that whole question. And the other difficult question lying behind that is Saul and the crowd, and how faith can lead us to do the most horrific things.
Yes. Yes.
I mean, sometimes we resist, quite rightly, people who say on the internet, all wars are caused by faith. They're clearly not. But sometimes they use an excuse for it, but they're clearly not the reason. If you remove faith, you would still have wars, probably just as many as we ever have. But we can't entirely duck it.
No.
But faith does sometimes lead people to completely lose sight of humanity.
It does.
Around them. And I don't know whether it's even worth doing that in this context, but to ask the question, okay, so fair enough, your faith hasn't led you to stone someone to death, but has your faith, because you've got so wedded to some kind of religious dogma, led you to mistreat other people, led you to ignore the claims of a group of people who you have decided are sinful? Has it, how has it led you to lose sight of your humanness? Maybe, I don't know. That's a very big question to ask, isn't it? So whether this is the right forum, I don't know, but it's in there somewhere. Just to complicate matters. So I think I'd probably reserve the prayers of intercession for that, maybe to help people think that through, because it's there in the story. So now, wealth of ideas. So thanks to Rachel and Anne for sharing all of that with us.
Thank you to you too.
I hope that one thing, maybe two things that we've said have sparked a trail that will lead you to worship that's appropriate for the context in which you're going to be preaching. We're all going to be doing that. Which is, to be fair, we actually quite enjoy doing this, talking absolute worship week by week. But as you set about that task and we set about it too, I'm going to ask Anne if she'll pray with us as we go about that work. Thank you, Anne.
Okay, let's pray. Oh God, it is a joy to know that we are precious in your sight, that you have called us and trusted us to be your living stones. So we pray now that you will strengthen us and guide us as we prepare to lead your people in worship. That the words of our mouths may be somehow your words. That you will speak through us and all your people will know something new, something enlightening, something encouraging, something comforting through what we do this week. And so we pray in the name of Jesus Christ, our cornerstone. Amen.
Amen.